October 20th, 1944. 6:15 in the morning. Red Beach, Leyte Gulf, Philippines. Lieutenant Colonel Ryoichi Yamamoto stood in the concrete observation bunker his engineers had spent 6 months building, watching through binoculars as the American armada materialized from the pre-dawn darkness. 700 vessels. He counted them systematically, professionally, the way an engineer measures structural loads before catastrophic failure. Battleships, their 16-inch guns elevated toward his position. Cruisers, destroyers, minesweepers, landing craft stretching to the horizon in formations so dense they obscured the sea. He had expected resistance. He had prepared defenses for resistance. What approached was not resistance. It was industrial-scale, overwhelming force. His garrison commander, Lieutenant General Shiro Makino, had 20,000 men on Leyte. Good men. Veterans who had survived Bataan, who had held these islands for 3 years, who believed they were defending the empire's lifeline to the oil of Borneo and the rubber of Sumatra. They had constructed 3 defensive lines across Leyte Valley, stored supplies in the central mountains, positioned artillery to cover the landing beaches. And now Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo had ordered something Yamamoto could not reconcile with military logic. Let them land. All of them. Allow 60,000 American troops to establish beachheads without meaningful resistance. Pull back. Preserve forces for a decisive counterattack when reinforcements arrived from Luzon. The mathematics made no sense. 60,000 Americans landing unopposed would become 100,000 within days. They would secure airfields, bring in bombers, establish supply depots that dwarfed anything Japan could transport across submarine-infested waters. Yet the order stood. Let them land. Yamamoto's radio operator approached, holding a decoded message from 14th Area Army Headquarters in Manila. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, commander of all Japanese forces in the Philippines. The message was brief. Acknowledge American landing. Execute withdrawal to prepared positions in Leyte Valley. Reinforcements departing Luzon immediately. Make Leyte the decisive battle. Destroy the enemy in depth. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Decisive battle. Yamamoto folded the message and looked again at the American fleet. 4 years of war had taught him to calculate industrial capacity from visible evidence. 700 ships suggested a construction program orders of magnitude beyond Japan's ability to match. The landing craft alone numbered in the hundreds, more than Japan's entire amphibious fleet. Each battleship represented resources Japan could no longer replace. But orders were orders. At 0700 hours, the first American shells began landing. Not on his bunker specifically, but on every defensive position along the eastern coast simultaneously. The bombardment was not precision fire, seeking specific targets. It was area saturation, the kind of fire mission possible only for a military with ammunition in seemingly infinite supply. Yamamoto counted shells by sound, 6 battleships firing in coordinated salvos, 16-inch shells, each weighing over a ton, each capable of vaporizing his concrete bunker. 60 shells per minute. 3,600 shells per hour. The Americans maintained this rate for 4 hours. His defensive positions, built with 6 months of labor, ceased to exist as functional structures within 30 minutes. The trenches filled with rubble. The pillboxes collapsed. The carefully positioned machine gun nests vanished beneath craters 20 feet deep. And still, the shells kept falling. At 1000 hours, the bombardment shifted inland. Landing craft began their run to shore. Yamamoto, following his orders, gave the command his entire military career had trained him never to give. Fall back, withdraw to prepared positions, allow the landing to proceed. His soldiers, confused but disciplined, obeyed. They abandoned their coastal defenses, what remained of them, and moved inland through the jungle trails toward the secondary defensive line in Leyte Valley. Behind them, 130,000 American soldiers of Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's Sixth Army came ashore virtually unopposed. Yamamoto reached the Leyte Valley position by 1400 hours. From the hills overlooking the valley, he could see the American beachhead expanding, engineers already unloading bulldozers, tanks rolling off LSTs, supply dumps growing visible even at this distance. The Americans were not creeping ashore, hoping to survive. They were unloading an industrial operation. General Makino's headquarters had relocated to Jaro, in the Central Mountains. Yamamoto reported, there at 1700 hours. The command post was a series of caves, well concealed, adequately supplied for the 20,000 men currently on Leyte. Makino, 62 years old, a veteran of campaigns in China and the Philippines, sat at a camp table studying maps. "The Americans secured their initial objectives?" Makino asked. "Completely, sir. They are expanding the beachhead without encountering significant resistance. At current rates, they will control the entire Leyte Valley coast within 48 hours. Makino nodded. "As expected. As ordered. The 35th Army believes we can counterattack successfully once reinforcements arrive. The 1st Division is en route from Luzon. The 26th Division will follow. With combined forces of 65,000 men, we will drive the Americans back into the sea." Yamamoto said nothing. The mathematics argued otherwise, but questioning a superior officer's optimism was not his function. He was an engineer. He built things. He calculated structural loads and material requirements, and what he had seen that morning suggested structural loads his empire could not bear. 3 days later, October 23, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched Shogo 1, the most complex naval operation Japan had attempted since Midway. 4 separate fleet groups converging on Leyte Gulf from multiple directions. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force would serve as decoy, luring American carriers north. Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force and Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force would crush the American landing fleet from 2 directions simultaneously. The plan was tactically sophisticated. Strategically, it was a gamble with the last major naval assets Japan possessed. If successful, it would isolate the American ground forces on Leyte, cut their supply lines, and create conditions for a negotiated settlement. If unsuccessful, Japan's navy would cease to exist as a meaningful fighting force. Yamamoto received fragmentary reports over the next 4 days. Center force ambushed by American submarines in the Sibuyan Sea. Heavy cruiser Atago sunk. Admiral Kurita's flagship, Battleship Musashi, the largest warship ever built, hit by 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs, capsizing with 1,000 casualties. Southern force annihilated in Surigao Strait. Battleships. Yamashiro and Fuso destroyed by American battleships in the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history. Northern force destroyed at Cape Engano. All 4 carriers sunk. By October 26th, the Battle of Leyte Gulf had concluded. Japanese losses: 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, 9 destroyers, over 10,000 naval personnel. American losses: 1 light carrier, 2 destroyers, approximately 3,000 casualties. The mathematics of naval power had shifted permanently. Japan's combined fleet, assembled over decades of industrial effort, had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war strength. The Americans, through a construction program Yamamoto still could not fully comprehend, were replacing losses faster than Japan could inflict them. But Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo drew different conclusions from the battle. The American fleet had been engaged. Some American ships had been sunk. Therefore, the Americans must be weakened. Therefore, reinforcements to Leyte should continue. Therefore, Leyte would be the decisive battle. General Yamashita, commanding from Manila, disagreed. He had wanted to make the main defense on Luzon, where Japan had the bulk of its forces, supplies, and defensive positions. Leyte was an island with limited supplies, difficult logistics, and terrain favoring attackers with naval and air superiority. Fighting there meant transporting reinforcements across waters. The American submarines and aircraft now dominated. His superior, Field Marshal Hisaichi Terauchi, commanding Southern Expeditionary Army Group from Saigon, overruled him. Make Leyte the decisive battle, commit everything, destroy the Americans in depth. Tokyo had spoken. The decision was made. On November 1st, 1944, the first major reinforcement convoy departed Manila for Ormoc Bay on Leyte's western coast. 4 transports carrying the 1st Division, approximately 10,000 men, escorted by destroyers and covered by what remained of Japan's land-based air power. Yamamoto received the news at Makino's headquarters. 10,000 men, against an American force that had grown to over 160,000, with American air superiority complete. With American naval forces controlling all approaches to Leyte, the mathematics suggested catastrophe, but orders were orders. The convoy suffered its first losses before reaching Leyte. American carrier aircraft from Task Force 38 found them in the Sibian Sea, wave after wave. Grumman F-6F Hellcats, Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, Grumman TBF, Avenger torpedo bombers. The escorts fought back. The transports took evasive action. But the attacks continued with mechanical regularity, like factory production, each wave as fresh and coordinated as the first. 2 transports sunk, 1 transport damaged but able to beach itself near Ormoc. Approximately 6,000 men reached Leyte. 4,000 were lost. The survivors arrived without heavy equipment, without artillery, without adequate supplies. They disembarked directly into combat as American forces pushed toward Ormoc from the north and south simultaneously. Yamamoto watched from the hills above Ormoc as the 1st Division reinforcements integrated into defensive positions. These were good soldiers. Experienced, disciplined, but they carried only what they could swim with. Their heavy weapons lay at the bottom of the Sibian Sea. Their ammunition supply amounted to what each man could carry in his pack. Against them, American forces advanced with tanks, artillery, air, support, and supply lines that seemed to extend infinitely backward toward Red Beach, where Yamamoto had watched the initial landing. He had seen the supply dumps there growing daily, mountains of ammunition, fields of fuel drums, warehouses of food, more material than his entire division had received in 6 months of garrison duty. The 2nd reinforcement convoy departed Manila on November 9th. 7 transports carrying elements of the 26th Division, approximately 12,000 men. Yamamoto heard the reports 2 days later. All 7 transports sunk or damaged. American destroyers entered Ormoc Bay and shelled the docks while the convoy attempted to unload. American PT boats attacked at night. American aircraft struck during day. Approximately 8,000 men reached shore, 4,000 lost. Again, the survivors arrived without heavy equipment. The pattern repeated through November. Tokyo kept sending convoys. 9 convoys total. Approximately 45,000 men attempted the crossing. Perhaps 34,000 reached Leyte. Perhaps 10,000 tons of supplies made it through. Against an American force of over 170,000 men, supported by carrier task forces, land-based air power, and a logistics system Yamamoto still struggled to comprehend. By late November, Yamamoto's engineering unit had been tasked with something new, not building defenses, not repairing damage, harvesting rice from Filipino civilians, foraging in the jungle. The supply system had broken down. Ships carrying food and ammunition were being sunk faster than Tokyo could replace them. The soldiers on Leyte were beginning to starve. Yamamoto's daily ration had been 800 grams of rice. By November 20th, it was 400 grams. By November 25th, 200 grams supplemented with whatever could be found in the jungle. Sweet potato leaves, palm hearts, snails. His soldiers were losing weight, losing strength, contracting, diseases from contaminated water. Meanwhile, the Americans advanced methodically through Leyte Valley, not in wild charges or desperate assaults, in coordinated movements supported by artillery bombardments that made Japanese counterfire impossible. American artillery ammunition seemed infinite. Japanese artillery fired sparingly, rationing shells because no resupply was coming. On December 7th, 1944, 3 years to the day after Pearl Harbor, the Americans landed the 77th Infantry Division south of Ormoc City, unopposed. The naval convoy supporting them was attacked by kamikaze aircraft, the new desperate measure Japan had adopted. 55 aircraft, 16 raids, multiple ships damaged, but the troops landed. 3 regiments, unopposed, directly into Ormoc Valley. Yamamoto received the news at headquarters. The Americans had just performed an amphibious landing behind Japanese lines as casually as a training exercise. They had done in one morning what Japan, with its limited amphibious capacity, would need weeks to plan and execute. And they had done it while simultaneously maintaining offensive pressure from the north and holding defensive positions across the entire eastern coast. General Makino, increasingly gaunt from malnutrition, looked at the map. Ormoc was the only port through which reinforcements could arrive. With American forces north and south of it, the port was effectively cut off. No more convoys would be coming. The 65,000 Japanese troops on Leyte were isolated. "We will continue resistance," Makino said quietly. "We will hold the central mountains. We will deny the Americans use of the island. We will fight to the last man, if necessary." This was no longer about winning. It was about honor, about showing Japan could resist, about buying time for Luzon's defense, though that defense had been stripped of divisions now dying on Leyte. On December 10th, Ormoc City fell. The Americans linked their northern and southern forces. Japanese resistance fragmented into isolated pockets scattered across the central mountains. Communication between units broke down. Supply distribution ceased. What remained of the 16th, 1st, 26th, and elements of the 8th, 30th, and 102nd Divisions began the slow process of dying in the jungle. Yamamoto's unit, cut off from headquarters, numbered 60 men by mid-December. They had ammunition but no food. They could fight but not sustain fighting. The jungle provided minimal nutrition. Men began dying from malnutrition before the Americans found them. On December 19th, a message reached Yamamoto through runners. General Yamashita had informed General Suzuki, commanding 35th Army, that no further reinforcements or supplies would be sent to Leyte. The forces there should become self-supporting. The decisive battle would now be fought on Luzon. Self-supporting, on an island where the Pitig, Americans controlled all ports, all airfields, all supply routes, where the jungle provided subsistence but not sustenance, where 65,000 Japanese soldiers were scattered across mountains with no unified command, no logistics, no hope of reinforcement. Yamamoto did the mathematics. If the landing had been opposed, if the decisive battle had been fought on Luzon with all these divisions intact, if the naval forces had been preserved instead of committed to a failed operation, would the outcome have been different? He did not know, but he knew what had happened instead. 60,000 Americans had been allowed to land unopposed. They had grown to 170,000. They had been reinforced and resupplied continuously, and against them, 65,000 Japanese soldiers had been committed piecemeal, arriving without heavy equipment, without adequate supplies, without air or naval support. By December 26th, American forces announced the end of organized resistance on Leyte. This was technically accurate. There was no longer organized resistance. There were scattered groups of starving soldiers hiding in the mountains, waiting to die or surrender. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Yamamoto's group survived in the mountains until January 9th, 1945. By then, only 18 of his original 60 men remained alive. They had not been killed in combat. They had died from malnutrition, disease, and despair. On that day, American patrols found them. Yamamoto expected execution. He had heard the stories about American brutality. Instead, the American soldiers provided water, food, medical care. They treated Japanese prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards, even prisoners whose army had often ignored such standards. The contradiction confused him more than the defeat. In the prisoner of war camp on Leyte Yamamoto received regular meals, 800 grams of rice, canned vegetables, meat, more food than he had eaten in the last 2 months of fighting. He also received information, casualty figures, battle reports, the full scope of what had happened on Leyte. Japanese losses, approximately 49,000 to 80,000 dead, depending on which estimates proved accurate. 4 divisions destroyed as fighting units, 26 major warships sunk, 46 large transports destroyed, hundreds of merchant ships lost. Over half of Japan's Philippine-based aircraft gone. And for all this, Leyte remained firmly in American hands. Airfields operational, supply depots established, the springboard to Luzon prepared. American losses, approximately 15,500 casualties, 3,500 killed. The disparity suggested something Yamamoto's engineering mind could not ignore. This had not been a battle, it had been an industrial process. American production capacity applied to military operations. Years later, after the war ended, after Japan surrendered, after Yamamoto returned to a homeland occupied and transformed, he would try to explain to students what Leyte meant. Not tactically, not about the battles or the commanders or the brave sacrifices, about the decision to let 60,000 Americans land unopposed, then reinforce them with 65,000 Japanese troops committed piecemeal across waters the Americans controlled. The decision made not through strategic calculation, but through institutional inability to acknowledge that Japan had already lost a war, it continued fighting. He would tell them about standing in that observation bunker on October 20th, watching 700 American vessels materialize from darkness, about counting shells during the 4-hour bombardment, about receiving orders to withdraw, to allow the landing, to preserve forces for a decisive counterattack that strategic mathematics made impossible. He would tell them about the convoys, 9 convoys attempting to cross waters dominated by American submarines and aircraft, 45,000 men sent, 10,000 lost in transit, the survivors arriving without equipment, without supplies, to fight against overwhelming material superiority. He would tell them about December 19th, when the message arrived that Leyte should become self-supporting, that no more help was coming, that the decisive battle would be fought elsewhere. That 65,000 men had been expended for a strategic objective that was being abandoned, and he would tell them about the arithmetic, not the propaganda arithmetic of fighting spirit and warrior culture, the industrial arithmetic of production capacity, logistics, and material resources. The arithmetic that said allowing 60,000 enemy soldiers to land unopposed, then attempting to defeat 170,000 with 65,000 reinforcements, committed piecemeal, was not strategy. It was institutional suicide disguised as doctrine. Leyte cost Japan 4 divisions it could not replace, ships it could not rebuild, aircraft it could not manufacture. All committed to a battle that strategic circumstances made unwinnable from the moment the first American landed unopposed on Red Beach. The decisive battle Japan sought to fight required stopping the Americans at the water's edge or not fighting at all. Instead, institutional pride, bureaucratic inertia, and an inability to acknowledge strategic impossibility led to a decision that sacrificed 65,000 men for no strategic gain. Yamamoto survived Leyte. Most did not. And in the camps, in the hospitals, in the prisons where survivors waited for repatriation, one question haunted them all. Why had they been sent to die for a battle their commanders knew was already lost? The answer, Yamamoto eventually understood, was simpler and more terrible than any tactical explanation. Because the institution could not admit error without destroying itself, because fighting spirit had replaced strategic calculation, because the mathematics of defeat had been visible but invisible at the same time, rendered unspeakable by a culture that valued honor over acknowledgement. On Leyte, Japan lost more than 4 divisions and 26 warships. It lost 67 days of fighting that accomplished nothing except confirming what the logistics tables had already proven. That allowing an enemy with overwhelming industrial superiority to establish a foothold unopposed, then attempting to dislodge them piecemeal, was not war. It was delayed inevitability. Lieutenant Colonel Ryoichi Yamamoto stood in that observation bunker on October 20th, 1944, watching 700 American ships, and he knew the mathematics were impossible. The decision was catastrophic. The war was lost. But he followed his orders anyway, because that was what soldiers did. And 65,000 men followed theirs, and most of them died, and Leyte became not a decisive battle, but a decisive confirmation of industrial supremacy over institutional delusion. The Americans called it liberation. The Japanese called it defeat. Yamamoto, who had studied engineering before the war, who understood structural loads and material properties, and the mathematics of catastrophic failure, called it something else. Proof that fighting spirit cannot overcome production capacity. That courage cannot compensate for logistical impossibility. That allowing 60,000 enemy soldiers to land unopposed and expecting to defeat 170,000 with piecemeal reinforcements was not strategy. It was mathematics ignored until mathematics became mortality. The prisoner of war camps where Yamamoto and other survivors waited for repatriation told a different story than propaganda. American guards provided adequate food, medical care, protection from Filipino guerrillas who, having suffered 3 years of Japanese occupation, wanted revenge. The Geneva Convention standards were applied even to an enemy whose forces had often ignored them. Private Eiichi Ogita, who had survived the submarine attack on his transport schooner, spent 4 months in the mountains after his battalion commander died and his unit fragmented. When American patrols found him in March 1945, he weighed 90 pounds, had lost 6 teeth to scurvy, and expected execution. Instead, he received medical treatment, food, and eventually transport home to Japan. The contradiction confused him as much as the defeat. In post-war interrogations conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, Japanese officers who had survived Leyte spoke with surprising candor. General Sosaku Suzuki, commanding 35th Army, had been killed in April 1945 attempting to escape Leyte by boat. But his staff officers, captured or surrendered, provided detailed accounts. Major General Toshio Nishimura, one of Yamashita's assistants, stated plainly that planning for Leyte was very bad. The decision to reinforce failure, to commit divisions piecemeal to an island where American naval and air superiority made resupply impossible, violated basic military logic. But Tokyo had ordered it. Field Marshal Terauchi had insisted. And so 65,000 men had been sent to die. The mathematics of Leyte echoed across the remaining months of the war. On Luzon, where Yamashita had wanted to concentrate forces, he commanded 250,000 troops. But 4 of his best divisions, approximately 65,000 men, lay dead or captured on Leyte. Their weapons, equipment, supplies, all lost. When American forces landed at Leyte Gulf on January 9, 1945, Yamashita faced them with forces significantly weakened by the Leyte decision. The battle for Luzon would be even bloodier. Over 8,000 Americans killed, 29,000 wounded. Japanese losses exceeded 217,000 dead. But Yamashita's defensive strategy, fighting from prepared mountain positions with established supply lines, prolonged resistance until the war's end. Had those 4 divisions lost on Leyte been available, had their equipment and supplies been preserved, the defense might have been even more formidable. The strategic consequences rippled outward. By losing Leyte, Japan lost the Philippines. By losing the Philippines, Japan was cut off from oil supplies in Borneo and Sumatra. Without oil, the remaining ships of the combined fleet sat inactive in port. Without fuel, pilot training programs could not operate. The industrial capacity to continue the war evaporated not because Japan lacked factories or workers, but because the resources to feed those factories were now inaccessible. Yamamoto, studying these facts in the prisoner of war camp, recognized a pattern. The same pattern he had seen, watching 700 American vessels materialize from darkness on October 20th. Industrial capacity, when properly applied, created a military advantage that tactical excellence could not overcome. The Americans had not won Leyte through superior fighting spirit or warrior culture. They had won through systematic application of overwhelming material resources. The construction program that produced 700 vessels was the same program that replaced losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The logistics system that landed 130,000 troops unopposed was the same system that sustained them through 2 months of combat in monsoon conditions. The industrial philosophy that treated warfare as a production problem, solvable through standardization and mass manufacture, had proven more effective than Japan's emphasis on individual excellence and technological sophistication. This was the lesson Yamamoto would carry for the rest of his life. Not that courage didn't matter, not that training was irrelevant, but that industrial capacity set limits on what courage and training could accomplish. That allowing an enemy with 10-to-1 production advantages to establish unopposed beachheads, then attempting to defeat them with piecemeal reinforcements across interdicted supply lines, was not strategy. It was arithmetic denial. In 1947, Yamamoto returned to Japan. The homeland he found bore little resemblance to the empire he had left. Cities firebombed, industry demolished, millions dead. The occupation administered by the same American military he had fought against. General MacArthur, who had waded ashore at Leyte on October 20th, now governed from Tokyo, overseeing reconstruction and democratization. The contradiction fascinated Yamamoto. The Americans, who had applied overwhelming force to destroy Japan's military, were now applying resources to rebuild Japan's economy. Food shipments, medical supplies, construction, materials. The same industrial capacity that had produced Liberty ships every 5 days was now producing aid packages. The same logistics system that had supplied forces across 9,000 miles of ocean was now distributing food to prevent starvation. He found work with a construction company in Nagoya, applying his engineering skills to rebuilding what war had destroyed. The work was humbling. Building roads, bridges, houses from rubble, but it provided perspective. War destroyed, industry built. The question was, which purpose industrial capacity served? By the 1960s, Japan's economy had recovered remarkably. The industrial capacity that had been directed toward military production now manufactured automobiles, electronics, consumer goods. The same systematic approach to production that had enabled Japan to wage war across the Pacific now enabled prosperity. The lesson of Leyte, Yamamoto realized, was not that industry determined military outcomes. It was that industry determined everything. When students asked him about the war, about Leyte specifically, he would show them maps. The eastern beaches where 130,000 Americans landed virtually unopposed. The western port of Ormoc, where 9 convoys attempted to deliver reinforcements, losing nearly half to American air and naval interdiction. The central mountains where 65,000 Japanese soldiers died, not from American bullets primarily, but from starvation, disease, and strategic miscalculation. He would explain the decision, not as tactics, not as courage or cowardice, but as institutional inability to acknowledge mathematical reality. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo believed wildly optimistic reports that American naval forces had been crippled at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Based on these false reports, they ordered a decisive battle on terrain that favored the enemy. When reality contradicted the reports, when convoy after convoy was decimated, when casualties mounted catastrophically, the institution could not reverse course without admitting error, and admitting error would undermine the entire system of authority that held the military together. So the convoys kept coming, the reinforcements kept dying, the decisive battle kept consuming divisions. Until December 19th, when Yamashita finally told Suzuki no more help was coming. By then, 65,000 men had been expended for nothing. The students, born after the war, struggled to understand. How could intelligent officers make such obvious mistakes? How could the institution continue a catastrophic policy when failure was evident? Yamamoto's answer was always the same, because the institution valued coherence over accuracy, because admitting strategic error required questioning the assumptions that justified the war itself. because the mathematics of defeat had been visible since 1943, when production ratios became undeniable. But acknowledging those, mathematics meant acknowledging that the war was unwinnable, and that acknowledgement was more dangerous to the institution than continued fighting. He would tell them about the Liberty ship, not the one he had seen, but the type. American shipyards building cargo vessels in 5 days. Not through superior craftsmanship, but through standardization, prefabrication, assembly line methodology. The same philosophy Henry Ford had applied to automobiles, now applied to warships. And by October 1944, America was producing more ships in a month than Japan could produce in a year. Against such disparity, tactical excellence was insufficient. Allowing the enemy to land unopposed, expecting to defeat them through counterattack, required either ignorance of industrial realities or willful blindness to them. Leyte demonstrated both. Tokyo received accurate casualty reports, convoy loss rates, supply deficit figures. All the data necessary to recognize the operation was failing. But the decision structure could not process that data without collapsing. In 1984, 40 years after Leyte, Yamamoto attended a commemoration ceremony. American veterans, Japanese veterans, Filipino veterans, gathering to honor the dead. 400 attendees from 3 nations, standing together on Red Beach, where 130,000 Americans had come ashore in 1944. Captain Paul Austin, who had led a bayonet charge as a company commander, shook hands with survivors from the Japanese 16th Division. Men who had tried to kill each other 4 decades earlier, now elderly, some in wheelchairs, sharing memories and photographs. Filipino veterans described the occupation. The brutality, the starvation, the summary executions. How the Japanese military police, the Kenpeitai, had intensified zonification after the American landing, systematically rounding up suspected guerrillas and sympathizers. How entire villages had been burned. How thousands of civilians had died. The Japanese veterans listened in silence. Some apologized. Most simply acknowledged. The facts were undeniable. The Imperial Japanese Army had treated occupied populations with systematic cruelty. That this cruelty had intensified as military situation deteriorated made it more comprehensible, but not less condemnable. Austin spoke about the American perspective. The landing had been almost unopposed, initial objectives secured within hours. But then came the mountains, the rain, the mud, Japanese defenders who fought from concealed positions, making every yard of advance costly. The campaign he expected to last weeks stretched to months. Friends died. Men he commanded were buried in that soil. But Austin also spoke about the prisoners. The starving, disease-ridden Japanese soldiers who surrendered or were captured. How American medics treated them. How supply officers fed them. How, despite everything, the Geneva Convention standards were applied. Not because the Japanese had reciprocated, but because maintaining those standards said something about American values. Yamamoto listened to all this and recognized the collision of 2 systems. One that valued honor above acknowledgement, that preferred death to surrender, that treated prisoners as shameful. Another that valued human life even when dealing with enemies, that maintained standards even when reciprocity was absent, that treated warfare as a problem to be solved rather than a test of national character. Neither system was purely good or evil, but one had proven more sustainable. The American system, with its emphasis on industrial logistics and systematic problem-solving, had won the war and then rebuilt the defeated nations. The Japanese system, with its emphasis on fighting spirit and honor, had led to catastrophic decisions like Leyte, where 65,000 men were sacrificed not for strategic gain, but for institutional coherence. Carlos Romulo, now 85, former Filipino, the foreign minister who had been with MacArthur at Corregidor in 1942 and at the Leyte landing in 1944, gave the closing address. He spoke of liberation, of promises kept, of the cost in Filipino lives, over 100,000 civilians dead during the campaign, of Manila, destroyed as thoroughly as Warsaw, raised by retreating Japanese forces in a final act of defiance. But he also spoke of reconstruction, of the American occupation that had led to independence in 1946, of the economic aid that had helped rebuild, of the difference between conquest and partnership. The Philippines had suffered terribly, but the nation that emerged was self-governing, developing, allied with former enemies. Yamamoto understood what Romulo was saying, that the Americans had won not just a military victory but a strategic one. By treating defeated enemies as future partners, by applying resources to reconstruction, by maintaining standards even in victory, they had created conditions for peace rather than sowing seeds for future war. This was the opposite of the Treaty of Versailles, the opposite of the harsh terms that had helped create the conditions for World War II. Flying back to Nagoya after the ceremony, Yamamoto reflected on the full arc. October 20th, 1944, watching 700 American vessels approach, receiving orders to withdraw, to let them land unopposed. The next 67 days of catastrophic fighting. January 9th, 1945. Capture by American patrols. The prisoner of war camps. Repatriation to a destroyed homeland. 40 years of rebuilding, of teaching, of trying to explain to students born in prosperity what their grandfathers had endured. What was the lesson of Leyte? Not that Japan lacked courage. The soldiers who fought and died demonstrated extraordinary courage. Not that Japanese commanders were incompetent. Many were skilled tacticians who did remarkable things with inadequate resources. The lesson was about systems, about how institutional structures process information, about what happens when strategic doctrine cannot adapt to industrial reality. The lesson was about mathematics. Allowing 60,000 enemy troops with overwhelming naval and air superiority to land unopposed, then attempting to defeat 170,000 with 65,000 reinforcements arriving piecemeal without heavy equipment, was not strategy. It was arithmetic that ignored inconvenient sums. The institution ordered it anyway because acknowledging the impossibility meant acknowledging the war itself was lost, and that acknowledgement was more threatening than continued casualties. The lesson was about production. The Americans built Liberty ships in 5 days. They replaced carriers lost at Leyte Gulf within months. They supplied forces across 9,000 miles of ocean continuously for 2 months of combat. This capacity was not accidental. It resulted from systematic industrial planning, standardization, and resource allocation. Against such capacity, tactical excellence could delay but not prevent defeat. The lesson was about aftermath. The Americans who destroyed Japanese military power also rebuilt Japanese society. The occupation was not gentle, but it was constructive. Food, medicine, infrastructure, education, all provided by the same nation that had firebombed cities and dropped atomic weapons. This suggested a strategic philosophy that looked beyond immediate victory to long-term stability, and the lesson was about acknowledgement. The mathematics of Leyte were visible on October 20th. 700 American vessels meant industrial capacity Japan could not match. Allowing unopposed landing meant losing strategic initiative. Reinforcing across interdicted supply lines meant high casualties for minimal gain. All this was calculable. None of it was secret. But the institution could not act on it because acting required, admitting the war was lost. So 65,000 men died anyway, and Leyte was lost anyway, and the Philippines were lost anyway, and the oil supplies were cut anyway. The delay purchased nothing except delay, at catastrophic human cost. Lieutenant Colonel Ryoichi Yamamoto died in 1997, 53 years after watching those 700 ships approach Red Beach. His obituary mentioned his military service briefly. Most of it focused on his post-war work as an engineer and educator. He had rebuilt roads, trained students, lived to see Japan become an economic power. But those who knew him understood that Leyte had defined him. Not the battle itself, not the fighting or the courage or even the defeat, but the decision. The mathematically impossible decision to let 60,000 enemies land, then try to defeat 170,000 with 65,000 reinforcements. The decision that killed 50,000 to 80,000 Japanese soldiers for no strategic purpose, except avoiding institutional acknowledgement of industrial impossibility. In his final lecture to students, 3 months before he died, Yamamoto showed them the maps one last time. Red Beach, Ormoc Bay, the Central Mountains, the dates, October 20th, December 10th, December 26th, the numbers. 130,000 Americans landed, 65,000 Japanese reinforcements sent, 50,000 to 80,000 Japanese casualties, 15,000 American casualties, 4 divisions destroyed, 26 warships sunk, the decisive battle that decided nothing except confirming what the production tables had already proven. He told them what he told every class: study the mathematics. Understand industrial capacity. Recognize when courage becomes insufficient. Question orders that contradict arithmetic. Remember that institutions can be wrong. Remember that fighting spirit cannot compensate for logistical impossibility. Remember that the hardest courage is not dying for decisions you disagree with, but questioning those decisions before they kill people. Remember Leyte, not for the battles or the heroism or the tragedy, though all were real. Remember it for the lesson. That allowing 60,000 enemy soldiers to land unopposed and expecting to defeat 170,000 with piecemeal reinforcements is not strategy. It is institutional suicide. It is mathematics ignored until mathematics becomes mortality. And remember the aftermath, the prisoner of war camps where enemies became human, the reconstruction where destroyers became builders, the peace where warfare capacity transformed into productive capacity. The lesson was not just about how wars are fought, but about how they end, how nations recover, and how former enemies become partners. Yamamoto died believing this was worth teaching. That future generations, given full knowledge of what happened and why, might recognize similar patterns before catastrophe. That understanding industrial reality, questioning institutional doctrine, and acknowledging mathematical impossibility might prevent future Leytes. That the 65,000 who died on that island might, through their sacrifice, teach something valuable about the limits of courage and the dangers of arithmetic denial. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.